So this is neither a webinar nor a workshop, but it's something in between. It's an extended conversation. I'm going to chat with David for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then you'll have a chance to ask any immediate questions. And then we'll break out into rooms so that you can take the discussion a little bit further through listening and talking to each other. And then we'll come back in for another chance to share ideas, your ideas as well, with David. And a couple of words on the elephant for those of you who haven't visited before. So over the past 3 years, the alternative has been asking the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And one thing is becoming clear to us, and that is that the current politics is only part of or in service to a socio-economic system that is currently busy destroying our planet. We won't be able to deliver a new politics until we have a good sense of the new socio-economic system that it would be part of. So the elephant is the project that tries to name the new system, the thing that we know is there, but we don't quite yet know how to talk about. So last December, we gathered 30 people together who we felt have been busy creating that system, and David was one of them, but have not yet, you know, the system's not quite yet come together. It's like the blind man and the elephant. Each one can see a part of it, but none of them can quite see the whole thing. So each episode of this series invites another one of these partially blind men or women to come and show us their perspective on the elephant, in the hope that over the whole of the series, we'll be able to sort of visualize it in our minds. So let me come now to David Wood, futurist, catalyst, author, and singularitarian. And David is actually tech aristocracy. His background is designing, architecting, implementing, and innovating smartphones. This includes 10 years with PDA manufacturer Scion PLC, 10 more with smartphone operating system specialist Symbian Limited, and 3 years as technology planning lead for Accenture Mobility. So any of you out there who are, who are a part of this technology world, you'll recognize all of David's achievements there. He's also the author or lead editor of 9 books with a focus on radical transformations in society and humanity that are enabled by accelerating technological disruption and mediated by social and political reaction. His most recent book is RAFT 2035, subtitled A Roadmap to Abundance, Flourishing and Transcendence by 2035. And previous books include The Abolition of Aging, imagine that, The Abolition of Aging, Transcending Politics, and Sustainable Superabundance. So David is now a full-time futurist, speaker, analyst, commentator, and writer. And in 2009, he was included in T3's list of 100 most influential people in technology. So I first met David around, I think it was around 2015, was it David? When he was in his function as host of London Futurists, where I was and still am regularly uplifted out of the political doldrums to see a possible future that in fact no political progressives are quite yet dreaming of. And suffice it to say that David was one of the 7 people in the room when the alternative first started taking itself seriously. So David, can I suggest that probably the best thing now would be for all of us to move to the speaker view and then give David a chance to, because I think he's going to be sharing his screen with us. And David, over to you. I hope that was enough of an introduction, but I'd like to give you the floor now and just start as well as you'd like to.
Well, what an introduction. I'm going to paint the future. I'll actually paint 3 futures, and I'm going to dare to think ahead, not just 15 days or even 15 weeks, but potentially I'm going to look ahead some 15 years and consider how society might change between now and then. And on this chart, I've got view of history up till the present time as being broadly increasing human flourishing. Of course, many things have got worse, but also many things have got better. But at the same time, the potential for damage has also increased as we have got more power at our hands. So looking ahead for what might happen in the next 15 years, most people who don't think about it that much will tend to assume that broadly it will be some evolution, some linear continuation, some business as usual. Perhaps things going a little bit better, perhaps things getting a bit worse. But I have to say that all of these middle of the road scenarios I view as pretty unlikely. I assign their probability or something like them as only 10%. That's not the kind of future I think is likely because of forces of change, including, though not limited to, what I'll describe as the fourth industrial revolution, which is just getting going. And if we're not careful, the fourth industrial revolution will tilt humanity's well-being downwards in what we might call an environmental catastrophe or a social collapse. And I rate that as far too likely. If I gave this talk 4 months ago, I would have said 30% probability. I'm now a little bit more disappointed and apprehensive. I rate that as a 35% likely. We might not get to that collapse or catastrophe by that time, but we would be well on the way to it. But if you're good at maths, you can figure out that there's another 55% scenario still left over in which we can take advantage of the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution and lots more to tilt humanity's well-being upwards into something I'll describe. This is one possible description of the elephant: sustainable abundance for all. And what we need to do, of course, is to lessen the chance of that really bad outcome and increase the chance of that really good outcome. And I've come to see three things as critical to that transformation. The first is to paint more clearly, more credibly, more vividly this picture of a positive techno-progressive transformation. That is not just vague words, it is something that people can see step by step building. At the same time, we can't deny the forces, the seismic forces that are at hand, and we have to deal with them. They are human forces. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of outrage, which if we don't handle properly, will push us in that direction. And third, this may be the most controversial thing that I'll talk about. Third is an extension of part of the number one, painting a vision. It is to clarify values to guide us in this, values that will make a difference, values that I will describe as transhumanist. But before we get there, let's look at this idea of a fourth industrial revolution. Here is a very oversimplified single slide picture of all of human history, or at least one way of looking at all of human history, in which the most critical things in terms of changing the world are waves of an industrial revolution, successive phases, arising out of an appreciation of science and engineering, critical methods, and arising out of an appreciation of openness in society, that you were allowed to criticize authorities, you were allowed to form alliances, and entrepreneurs can get together with technologists. So over a number of phases, the world got changed by steam and mechanization and trains, then it got changed again with electricity, displacing steam, with synthetic chemicals, changing agriculture, and so much more with mass production. A third phase of the Industrial Revolution when computers started displacing humans from the workforce. We had consumer electronics dating back to the first silicon integrated circuit in 1959. And we're about to see the bigger effects of the fourth phase, which I claim will be more impactful even than the big impacts from before. And I'll characterize it as NBIC convergence, which I'll explain, but before I do so, I'll just point out there is an acceleration of timescales here, at least in this telling, in which each next wave has come more quickly than the preceding wave. And this acceleration is driven by a very important phenomenon, which is positive feedback cycles, which is part of what's going to change the world more than most people expect, either for good or for bad, in the next 15 years. NBIC is what some radical futurists use as shorthand to refer to nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognotech, four different quadrants of a single set of changes. Nanotech is more precise control of matter at the nanoscale. In due course, we'll have nanobots, computers the size of just biological entities, and we will have quantum computing in due course. We already have 3D printing. We already have more sensors. Biotech is changing not our silicon, but changing our genes. And I can point to things like CRISPR with its miraculous breakthroughs of 2012, allowing us in due course more control over which genes are turned on or off and all the other biological layers. Infotech isn't just computing, it's machine learning based on big data, and 2012, almost by coincidence, was the breakthrough year for deep neural networks. C for cognotech, sometimes also called neurotech, is when we understand more about the human brain than ever before and find ways to improve the functioning of our brain. And there are four quadrants here because the top half is roughly hardware, the bottom half is roughly software, the left is broadly physics, the right is broadly biology. But what's more interesting is the crossover effects between these different quadrants. For example, nanotech allows us to have more nano sensors. We can find out what's happening without having to cut people's heads open. We can understand a lot of what's happening in their brain when people are being creative or meditating or being intuitive. And as we understand that more, the many PhDs in neuroscience who work for our leading AI companies are copying some of these ideas back into AI. And as AI improves, we have better understanding of, in due course, of personalized healthcare and so forth. So one reason why there's likely to be even more progress in each of these four fields is because of developments in one field allowing faster developments in others. And the other reason for change I already mentioned is positive feedback. The first industrial revolution had rudimentary machinery created by rudimentary tools, but as time went on, machinery built better tools, which built better machines, and so forth, unleashing more access to coal energy as well. The second industrial revolution included more power over synthetic chemicals, which were built from chemical reagents. The more chemicals we synthesized, the more chemicals we could build. Third industrial revolution involved computers, which initially were very difficult to manufacture and build, but you can use the disciplines of computer-aided manufacturing, computer-aided design to help build better computers. So the computers have been getting systematically better for all that time. And it's the same with software. Software is built by engineers using software tools, which means that smaller teams can build more powerful, more capable software with, on the whole, less faults in it. That's the past. The future includes more AI built by not just human engineers, but by engineers using AI tools. And this is something I'd love to talk at more length about, but I'll shortcut. Suffice to say that the improvements in one type of AI can lead unexpectedly to quicker improvements in other AI. The bigger picture of positive feedback is that we've got more people on the planet than ever before. And that's not just mouths to feed. It's not just people emitting greenhouse gases. It's more people who are more innovative because they are educated to higher levels, taking advantage of YouTube and all kinds of online materials. These people are also networked as never before. So it's no surprise that more networks create more tools and create more technology. And the tools improve the educational methods, the tools improve the networks. That's why we've got more artificial intelligence, more deep learning. That's why the world now has more active scientists than ever before, more active engineers building more products, taking advantage of more people who understand how to create businesses, how to change the user interface to make it more acceptable, and how to educate people. That's why I think the likelihood is there's going to be more technology change in the next 15 years than in any previous 15-year period in history, causing more disruption, either for good or for bad. But I have to apologize because I've sort of given the impression that all of this is happening somehow relentlessly, automatically. Of course, it is not. The technological change arising from application of science in open systems and driven by positive feedback cycles is very much influenced by how we humans respond. What legislation we put in place. Do we demand that a man walks in front of a motor vehicle with a flag if it's traveling more than 4 miles an hour? What other legislation do we put in place to curtail technology? Sometimes good legislation, sometimes foolish legislation. It depends on which new investments we subsidize. It depends on the skills that we encourage people to learn so they can flourish if done right with the new technologies. It depends on the services that are developed, services and design skills and agile project management and so forth. And critically, most important of all, it depends on what values we humans apply and to what extent we let go of values that were previously sought to be critical, but which no longer have much sway. And this, I've realized last evening, it's a slide I've used before. It's a sort of elephant picture. You can almost see the trunk of the elephant here and its tusks and its eyes if you squint. It's a systematic view, but it also allows me to point out two of the biggest problems with the next 15 years, which is if we have the human responses, the legislation, the subsidies, the services, and the skills still dependent, still targeting the technology of the past, then we are far from likely to get the best out of new technology, and we'll end up with many of our systems being captured by the previous systems. Like the man with the red flag walking in front of the car, he was there in part because MPs at the time had heavily invested in trains and weren't so keen on this newfangled automobiles. So that's one problem, but there's another particularly pernicious problem too, which is that those who do see the potential of the new technology often have a very naive understanding of it. And that won't help matters either. It means we will get ill-suited legislation and subsidies and so forth. And both of these problems are made worse. Both of these problems are magnified to the extent that the pace of change is increasing, which is why so many people are feeling disoriented. So where do we get the values from that will guide us to decide which things we should not do, even though science and technology gives us the power? Historically, of course, that was an easy question. Historically, people will have said, well, you ask the holy men and the holy women who have been in contact with divine beings. They will guide us. Nowadays, of course, this doesn't do much work because there are too many conflicting religious instructions. And if we're honest, many of these instructions have, at the very best, a mixed track record. Historically, we've also been told, don't worry, nature knows best. Let's live in a suitably balanced way with the right yin and yang or whatever. But if we're also honest, we have to recognize that nature is full of red in tooth and claw. Women, for most of history, went from one pregnancy to another with many children dying early. We had far too much natural diseases, natural decline, which is why most people nowadays, if they think about values, would probably describe themselves as humanists or post-humanists of one sort or another, where we use human well-being, our own judgment of human well-being, guided by our immersion in the community, guided by our reflection, guided by what we get from great literature, but Hemingway and Shakespeare as much as the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, guided by observing nature, but we're not putting too much faith on any one authority, and we're certainly not putting nature on a pedestal. But I say even that is not enough for the pace of change. So if I clear up this slide, I'm now going to argue for going beyond humanism. There's nothing wrong in these humanist principles, but I want to advocate for transhumanism, which sometimes called H+, in part because it's humanism plus the conviction that the human species as it is today, as we have reached here by evolution, is by no means the end of conscious development, but rather it is at a comparatively early phase. And if we are wise and smart and careful, if we avoid putting today's human nature on a pedestal, we can do much better in a relatively short space of time. And that frightens many people. Many people said we shouldn't tamper with human nature. Yes, of course, humans are foibles. Yes, we are stupid sometimes, but hey, isn't that what makes us brilliant? Isn't human nature too precious to mess around with? And some people say it's because we were created in such a way. Other people will say, well, evolution has made the best possible compromises. But transhumanists say, no, today's human nature is a mix of features. Some should be preserved, some should be enhanced, but other parts should be left behind. Like our sweet tooth, like our tendency to deceive each other and to deceive ourselves, all our cognitive biases, our misuse of power, whether it's power in the political sphere that we misuse, or power in the personal sphere that we misuse, we can't just accept today's human nature. We have to take advantage of the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution to change things. But again, I recognize many people are deeply uncomfortable at this proposition, and they say, who are you, David Wood or other transhumanists, to make these decisions? And I say, hang on, no, I am arguing for the best of all aspects of humanity to get together to work on this problem of carving out the positive future for human nature and getting to this humanity plus future. And it involves the best that science can give us. It involves appreciating all the wisdom of many cultures around the world, integrated with some imagination, a lot of imagination, so we're not just constrained by what worked in the past, but not letting our imagination have too many flights of fancy. It has to be, in the end, evaluated by our collective wisdom, in which we go step by step, watching along the way what changes are happening, but with a mind to the possibility that we can be much better than today. So just to wind things up, the future of human well-being, I said, if we put our minds to it, just as Kennedy said in 1961, we choose to go to the moon and back in this decade. I say we can choose sustainable superabundance for all, with most of the foundations being in place by 2035, taking advantage of many technologies, just as Kennedy and his advisors did not know exactly how to get to the moon and back when he made his bold vision. We can see only in outline terms, but we can flesh in a lot more. If we can accelerate the progress of green technology, we can have an abundance of clean energy. If we can accelerate synthetic biology, we can get rid of the practice of growing meat in farms, and instead we can switch to cultured, clean meat. We can take advantage of next generation nanotech, so we have things that are much better at recycling. We can build better material goods, better, stronger shelter. With rejuvenation technology, we can have affordable healthcare for all. With cognitive technologies and AI, we can have all-round intelligence. If we embrace the possibilities of automation, we should not be fearful we will lose jobs. Instead, we should embrace the extra time for creativity. If we use our space technology and inner space technology, we can have a lot to explore. And it will depend whether we really do take advantage of the abundance of possibilities for collaboration and democracy via social tech. That's the positive possibilities, but I have to say again, if we are not wise enough, a new dark age also lies within our vision. Not an abundance of good things, but I'll say a preponderance of bad things. If we don't develop green tech fast enough, we'll have the world with a preponderance of polluting energy, a preponderance of malnutrition, waste and biohazard, chronic diseases, of which COVID-19 is only a foretaste of what's to come. If we don't really learn collective wisdom. We will have people who are very powerful and very clever, but doing all kinds of nasty things to each other. If we don't embrace automation technology, we'll see a whole bunch more of back-breaking toil. And if we don't embrace the full possibilities of social technology, we will end up with ever greater inequality, ever greater partisanship, more tribalism. The differentiator is this social tech that I've spoken about once or twice. And if you're wondering where this fits into this picture, it's right at the center. And just as nanotech is about atoms and biotech is about genes and so on, social tech is really how do we ensure that the right values are given sufficient prominence. If we open the kimono and look down one level, I sometimes say here are the 25 ways in which the world will be changed in the next 15 to 20 years. But whether it's changed for good or ill really does depend on what we do in this central box. Whether we have our financial systems, our access to data, our access to ledgers and so on with sufficient attention, and probably the most important of all, whether we can ensure that the right things are conveyed freely in education to all and the right politics happens. So that's, sorry, slightly more than 20 minutes. Later on, if any of you are interested, we can dip into some of the stuff I've written about in these various books. But I'm going to wind back here and say thanks very much to everybody for being so patient. And I will stop sharing and let Indra and others have a word in edgeways.
Thank you so much, David. And as ever, quite a mind-blowing and exciting vision that you're putting to us, and also, you know, quite a challenge to think about, given this kind of bifurcation, you know, the sense that we could go this way or that way. I'm guessing that you think that this is, you know, this is a fork in the road in a sense, and it's right here, present now. Given that, you know, what sense do you have that there's anything at all that that a normal citizen, you know, somebody who's not, you know, pulling the levers of power, so to speak, not a government official or not a major philanthropist, you know, what can an ordinary citizen do at this point, do you feel, that would send us more in the direction that we'd all want to go?
So there's a lot that can be done, and I guess I should show my elephant picture again here. Certainly there's understanding the technological possibility. We should all become a bit more literate and learn to be more critical of some of the stories of hype that are just Hollywood fantasies or companies boasting about things they can never achieve, but at the same time seeing that there is genuine things there. So becoming a little bit more technologically savvy is important. But more than that, there's a lot more in that picture. There's figuring out what advice can we give to legislators, because the legislators always risk falling behind. They seem to be caught flat-footed. I don't think that's inevitable. We should be devising recommendations for which things we at all costs have got to constrain and which things we should be at all costs accelerating some of the next generation green. So there's that. And then there's thinking about the values question, you know. Are we going to argue that we should keep things more or less as before, you know, make the world great again, harking back to something imagined from the past, which many people think is the most of literature is always harking back to golden ages? Are we going to be more bold and say, you know, the world ahead could be very different? You know, it could involve people living much longer, much healthier, having extended fertility, having extended creativity, having robots and automation doing all the tasks which previously we expected humans to do in the workplace. Let's get involved in these discussions about values. And last, there's building alliances, which is what I know the elephant focuses on. It's network of networks. It's joining the dots, allowing people who at first may feel they're quite separate from each other, even alienated from each other, but figuring out the ways in which they, at a bigger level, we're all in this together. So these are some things that I believe everybody can be part of. And it's important to have interim goals. So rather than just saying, well, it might be like this in 2035, it's very important to have shorter term goals too. So if anybody were to look at my latest book, RAFT 2035, you will find that for each of the 15 goals in there, what might happen by 2035, there are two interim targets which I think could be done by 2025. And sometimes it's about getting bits of the law changed. Sometimes it's about getting funding for various proofs of purpose. Sometimes it's about just clarifying how this world could work. You know, if we're not focusing on GDP anymore, what should we be focusing on? Let's clarify this picture. So there's lots of short-term things there too, in principle.
Thank you. And I know that I could chat with you now for the next few hours, but I do occasionally have the chance to do that. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to the room and invite people, rather than put your questions into the box, please, if you want to ask David a question, look at your screen below, you'll see the chat box. Just put your name in there. And that's the best way for me to invite you one by one in the order that you get into the box, if that's okay. So I think, Kirsten, you've already put a question in there.
Yes.
Do you want to just ask David that? Speak
Yep.
it yourself.
Sure, thank you. So David, I guess with those things that you had mentioned, I want to sort of understand what you think the top ethical considerations are going to be for us going forward. You know, there, you know, certain things like life extension, stuff that you mentioned in biotech about gene therapy and so on. You know, and obviously dependent on your worldview, I guess, whether you think things are ethical or not. What are your views on what those things might be?
I had one more slide which I took out, which was my 10 principles of transhumanist values and ethics. But if I had to pick only two, the first would be greater transparency. You know, we have to go beyond the system in which many things work for reasons we don't quite know. We're not quite aware of which forces there are in the world. AI is still a black box in many ways. As much as possible, we should be driving these things into the open discussion. Questions of bias and fairness, actually, they're quite complicated. If you have various seemingly plausible views on bias and fairness, it often turns out that they are mathematically irreconcilable. You know, the different principles will lead you to do different things. Well, rather than just leaving it to a software engineer to make that decision, let's get these tensions out into the open when we can have a more considered discussion. So the highest thing that's most important now is transparency. And then the second thing is the possibility that actually politics can be a good, positive force, and that the state sometimes is the right way in which we can make progress. Politics has got such a bad name. We all look around and we feel contempt for so many politicians, and we say, oh, they're just power mad and they're always corrupted. We should have as much individual liberty as possible. Yes, but we won't have individual liberty unless there are some regulations that are put in place and kept in place. So what the government has been doing with various laws about lockdown and masks, you know, it's forcing us to behave in ways that we probably wouldn't unless there was some central coordination. So politics can be a positive force, but only if, as well as a powerful state, there is a powerful society. Only if there is a transparent evaluation of what's going on, only if there's a division of power, and to the extent to which there is too much accumulation of power, then we will end up having terrible political failures. So let's have a better politics, and don't try and put it all on individual liberty. We will not have people having much liberty if others around us are behaving badly.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Kirsten. Walter, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. It's one of your thoughts, David, as to how do we get a wider engagement with these issues? I mean, at the moment, we seem to live in a world where, should we say, the conservative forces that would push us in the wrong direction are very good at communicating, and you only have to look at the politics in terms of the States and the UK and so on. There seems, if you take the average man in the street, almost total oblivion to the sort of things that that you're talking about and the challenges. And then how do we get, have you got any thoughts as to how we get past this obsession, this total enticement with materialism and consuming, and get people engaged in a more informed and a more forward-looking debate. Because until there are more than, whatever it is, 23 people taking part in meetings like this, the negative forces will dominate, is
Yep.
I guess where I come from.
So I think on my first slide, I said one of the most important things is credible, vivid communications of a positive future. It's because people don't see a credible possibility of such a future that their horizons shrink and they look instead to material well-being or other things. So we have to be better at communicating, and it's not easy. You know, there is lots of skills that need to be brought in here. But I'll point to one positive example. The positive example is what changed in the 1980s between Gorbachev and Reagan. When Reagan came to power in 1980, he talked about the Soviet Union as being the evil empire. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he inherited, 68 years of viewing the West and the US as being a fearful foe. Ronald Reagan was hell-bent on something called Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, building a more fearsome weaponry. And what changed? Oh, there's many ways to tell this story, but the way I like to tell it is that Carl Sagan, an inspired futurist, came up with an understanding which gripped the world. And the understanding was, hey, you guys, if you let off your nuclear bombs, you won't just be frying a number of cities, you will be triggering something that had never been understood before, nuclear winter. You know, there will be this dust clouds in the air. And we take nuclear winter for granted now, but in the mid-1980s, it wasn't. And this caused bright people in Gorbachev's circle and in Reagan's circle to say, you know, this is a new way of looking at things. And he tipped them both over from being fearful opponents into being more ready to give each other a bit of benefit of the doubt. So we need more people like Carl Sagan who can find a way to communicate vividly and compellingly. And so when the question came earlier from Indra, what can normal people do? Maybe that would have been a better answer. We need to all learn and identify amongst us who are the talented communicators, and they must also communicate the right visions for the future. Because if we communicate a naive and foolish vision of the future which falls to pieces under a bit of probing, that will be counterproductive. So it has to be a vision of the future that's informed by what's truly possible, and then it's got to grab people. But if we don't do that, then people will not change. I'll say one more thing here. One of the most interesting students of change in organizations, who's written a great deal about it, is John Cotter, Harvard professor who wrote a very influential book 20 years ago or so, Leading Change, Why Change Initiatives So Often Fail in Large Companies. And the two most important reasons he identified are, one, lack of a sense of urgency. People say, yeah, I guess this seems important, but you know, it seems something like we can put off. And second, lack of a sufficiently compelling vision of a better future. So we need to do both, which is why I have painted both, I think, a credible bad future and a credible good future. And I encourage more people to get involved in their own ways. Make better videos, make better narratives, better fiction, so we can displace the black mirrors from our TV screens with suitably interesting white mirrors instead.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to invite Simon. Would you want to put a question to David? And then after that, we're going to go into breakout rooms. And Mary, I hope we'll have a chance to answer your question after the breakout. So Simon, please go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. I'm just kind of getting my thoughts together. It's not a specific question. It's a kind of a wondering that might spark, a response from you. So I was really interested to see your slides, and you kind of talked about values, and you seemed to posit, you know, that we were looking at religious values or nature-based values or humanism, and you got to kind of humanism plus or transhumanism. And I'm personally really interested in, and you talked also later about religion in some way, that it was a kind of from the past. Those weren't exactly your words, but I'm really interested in what a future focused kind of inclusive definition of the sacredness of all life in terms of our interconnected systems of interdependence, where spirituality is not at odds with science, but actually in a kind of partnership with that. I'm really interested in that as a vision of the future. I really like that you then talked about vision, like what are the stories we can tell about what the future possibilities are, and you had your abundance list of 8 points, and then, you know, kind of the binary, you said, well, and if we don't, this is the kind of the black future. And you talked about sustainable superabundance for all, and I kind of wanted to say, well, who's all for you? Because for me, I believe there's a possibility of a future where we can create abundance for all beings, humans, animals, the planet, with a good balance of technology, as well as our natural, human and ecological technologies. So yeah, I don't know if there's a question in there, but I kind of see a third way, actually, building on what you've shared, and I'd just be interested to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
Well, these are super questions, and I already regret not saying more about these topics in my slides, but I'll try now. For all, who is for all? Well, you're quite right. There is the possibility of building a better society for other conscious beings too, other sentient or sapient beings. So in my list of, I think, 10 transhumanist principles, 5 or 6 is, by the way, we should extend this as far as possible to all beings with elements of consciousness. And there are transhumanist thinkers such as David Pearce, who talks about remaking all of nature, so there is no longer any involuntary suffering anywhere in nature, which is an even bigger vision than the one I have portrayed. But in terms of the role of religion, no, it's true. We can go beyond just being more rational, go beyond just being more emotionally resilient, to having higher spiritual experiences in the sense of connecting in some kind of ways that we can only vaguely glimpse. Occasionally we encounter people, mystics, seers. Occasionally we ourselves get into the flow mode, but it is a very occasional thing, and most of the time we're not at that higher levels of consciousness. And we do need to find the ways to get there more reliably. Because when people glimpse that, then that's part of what will partially answer Mary Fee's question. That's partly what makes us less interested in money. It's when we see this alternative dimensions. And I do think that technology has part of a role to play here, that the right kind of music, the right kind of brainwaves, the right kind of diet, the right kind of drugs. There is a role for magic mushrooms of a sort, modern magic mushrooms, hallucinogenics, nootropics, done with care. Like all technologies, they are two-edged swords. A motor car can be devastatingly bad, so we insist that people learn to drive and pass the driving license first. It's the same with hallucinogenics and nootropics. But with this, we can, more of us, gain access to these higher levels of consciousness more often, and it will put us not into a state of timidity or a state of accepting things that should not be accepted, but it will give us the strength and the courage to then be bolder about changing the parts of society and the parts of ourselves which are impeding our true transhumanity.
Thank you very much. That was quite a note to strike. And I'm going to invite everybody to go into breakout rooms now. And we don't have that much time because just, you know, so many interesting questions and answers. So I'm going to suggest that just for 15 minutes, we're going to go into breakout rooms of just three people, I think we'll go for. 3 to 4 people, and maybe just introduce yourselves and think about the two, and inviting you to think about the 2 extremes that David pointed at, and maybe share amongst you what you're feeling about that choice, and whether you're whether that makes you feel stronger, or does it make you feel weaker to know that we're in this moment of choice. And then come back after 15 minutes and we'll share our thoughts again. Good, welcome back everybody. I do know that because of our clash with dinner or supper and children, that people
and
do
compass.
drop out at this point. But
compass as well.
It's nice to have you back. And let me see who's the first. So Mary, did you? Well, of course you were in a room there with David, so I'm going to have to make the assumption that you had your question answered.
Not quite.
And
somebody else was asking a question before me, weren't they? I don't know. Am I the next one?
No, that was Simon. So, would anybody like to ask a question, or Simon, Mary, you're free to as well, or make a comment maybe from the conversations that you had in the breakout rooms. I'd like to hear how you fared.
Yes, we started talking a bit about capitalism. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And I think the way I look at it is that it's changed. It's become corrupted. Once upon a time, I think that it was useful being able to borrow money so that you could invest it, so that you could create infrastructure, and legitimate to make a profit. But people are making profit about all sorts of weird things. They've figured out how to play the system, and this is where I think governments don't seem. They're the rich boys, as they're all mates with the rich boys, aren't they? So they're not bothered about curtailing these excesses, and anyway, that's there doesn't seem to be because it's just corrupting everything else. Why is it that we've got austerity? It's so that some people could get rich, could stay getting richer and richer. Why is it that we've got people who are too poor to feed themselves in this country, and people are running around in this COVID climate, running around delivering food parcels? It's disgraceful that people's good energy has to be spent on these basic things.
So David, I'd like to invite you to make a comment.
So I said that politics was a good force, but it needs to be constrained by a powerful society. I will say the same thing about capitalism and the free market. There is so much good that can be achieved by giving people the freedom to experiment with creating products that the authorities never imagined people would want. The authorities in the Soviet Union, they figured out what they thought people would want, and often it wasn't. And you need the freedom and experimentation to do it. So I am very much in favor of allowing capitalism to flourish, but with constraints, just as politics needs to be constrained. And the problem is that we haven't got the right countervailing constraints, in part because so much is happening outside of public sight. So much is not being clarified, needs to be reported on. And we also need more powerful motivations to balance it. And one good thing recently is that we did have a bit of a backlash when people said, oh, let the old people die, let's have a herd immunity, it doesn't matter so long as the economy keeps going. Society as a whole said, hang on, no, we don't think that, we're not just going to let old people die. We're going, all lives matter. And so there's been a bit of a pushback there, and we need more of that. We need more of that pushback, and we need to ensure that the tendencies of capitalism are properly kept in place, and from time to time we should restructure it and say this is not going to be allowed anymore, even if it was successful in the past. So it needs nuance. It's not, I'm against two kinds of fundamentalists: pro-market fundamentalists and anti-market fundamentalists, but each of them, I think, have an oversimplified view of something which is more complicated, and we humans need to see that complexity and appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Bob, I think you would like to ask a question.
Hi, David.
Hi, Bob.
Long time no see. I'm really sorry I turned up late. I had it in my calendar started at 5:30, my mistake. So I only got to see your last two slides. However, I did see your final slide, so I kind of got a feeling. I want to ask you the question, are there enough resources and is there enough energy in the world to create this new world for 9 billion people?
Absolutely, yes, but it's going to be hard work. So there's plenty of energy hitting the earth from the sun in just a few hours to meet all human needs, but my goodness, we need to be better at capturing it and distributing it. And today's green energy technologies are not enough, and although they are improving quite remarkably, the pace of change is still not enough. So we have to put stronger incentives in place. We need a more aggressive carbon tax or something to ensure that the engines of capitalism are more focused on green technologies instead of clever ways to keep on polluting. So it's complicated, but no, I think the world could cope with a lot more than 9 billion people, in part if we reform agriculture as well, so that large parts of the land are not given over to farming animals, but instead we change our diet, including synthetic, lab-grown or cultured meat.
Thank you. And just to explore that a little bit more, do you imagine that that's the way we are going to go? I mean, in terms of the investment now in artificial meat, do you have a sense that that's the big growth market and people will give up meat more?
That's one of them. Most of us who eat meat turn a blind eye to all kinds of bad things that are happening. There's about 7 reasons why current meat is very bad for all kinds of things. So we use too much water, we use too much land, there's huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions from both ends of the cattle. We pump them full of antibiotics and therefore increase antibiotic resistance. And of course, there's the suffering involved, and lots of meat isn't very healthy because it's got, despite all the antibiotics, it's still got cholesterol and so on. So there is a big market, which many companies have pursued. Mark Post is one of the great thinkers in this. There's a book that came out just last month by Jenny Kleeman. It's called, don't laugh, it's called Sex, Robots and Vegan Meat. And she looks at the future of robots offering intimate relationships, and she looks at the future of meat grown by many people who, it turns out, are vegan. She also looks at artificial wombs. Children in the future might be born outside of the human body, and she looks at new ways to die. And she has some very interesting research on what these companies are doing. And it's not going to be straightforward. There's going to be many stumbles along the way, but in due course, the price will come down. In due course, it will be demonstrated that this stuff is actually healthier for us than normal meat. And in due course, more companies will pile in, but it'll be the usual way. It's going to be slow, disappointing before faster takeoff. We actually go faster with fish. If meat is murder, fish is genocide. We have almost killed whole races of fish. And worse, fish has got more microplastics in it. And there is some evidence that we should stop eating fish because we're doing bad things to our body that never happened before. We used to say fish is so healthy. Well, it's no longer true. And fish farms aren't a good solution either. But if we could there's a company called Finless Fish. I think it's called Finnish Fish or Finnish Food, which means you grow the fish, but it's not actually a real fish. It's just the meat of the fish. So some of this will come along, but whether it's going to succeed, alternatively, we might just all end up going traditional vegetarian, and there's lots, we just need change. But the culture may suddenly tip, just as years ago, we didn't mind much about smoking. We say, yeah, people can smoke if they like. A while back, we used to say, it didn't matter if people drink and drive, you know, we all make our own decisions. Now we're horrified when we walk into a restaurant and people are smoking there, and we're horrified when we see people drinking and driving. We're likely to be horrified in the future at the bad things we are currently doing to animals, and we'll wonder, how on earth did we get away with it? And we'll pull down statues of great politicians because, well, I'm joking now, but just as we pull down famous statues in the past because they were, sadly, racist, it turns out we might pull down today's great figures because we were too prone to eating meat, perhaps.
Maybe, indeed. Stevie, you'd like to ask a question?
Self unmuted. Yeah, I run into a lot of divisiveness on social media platforms. I've got kind of mixed feeling about them. Some of the worst bits about it seem to be sort of growing polarization. I'm having a kind of problem how to manage this. Have you got any good ideas about how we could best negotiate some of the worst. I'm really for freedom of speech, but at the same time, I'm having a problem with the misinformation that's being hijacked. I mean, honestly, so much is going on right now.
I have a prediction. It's going to get worse before it gets better, sadly. I say there are cleverer AI algorithms deployed to be even smarter at worming their way into our desires. We will be led into even more of intense character if we're not careful. And so this is a very important issue. And we've got to put pressure on Facebook and Twitter and all these other things to act responsibly. Now, it's difficult because, of course, we want to preserve freedom of speech, but at the same time, we have to say all these people shouting and spreading conspiracies, it's very bad for our collective psyche. Now, in part, we can immunize ourselves, in part, we can learn, but it is hard. And even despite us becoming more rational and more thoughtful, I think there's still a case for appropriate legislation of these, and there's a case for building alternatives, but it's hard to build alternatives. Jimmy Wales has done great work with Wikipedia, has tried to create an alternative to Facebook, WTS or something, but it's hardly taking off because guess what, you got to pay money to join it, and we're so used to getting Facebook without paying any money for it, and there's not enough happening there yet, so even if you were to pay, you wouldn't have the same thrill Facebook. So this deserves a lot more attention. In part, the start is to be transparent about it. Thankfully, people are writing more about it. One of the earliest investors in Facebook, Roger McManey, has written a very good book called Zucked about the terrible things that's happened in Facebook and the oblivious approach taken by Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. We need to put more pressures on this. But today's politicians, especially the older ones, are probably not the people to get involved. And we need, therefore, to help these politicians by coming up with suitable regulatory ideas. Some of the younger politicians get it a bit, so that's a start, and we should help them.
So if I could just follow up a little bit on that as a question, I think you've mentioned quite a lot of times, David, regulation as a role in shaping this better future. But you've also talked about the evolution of the human being and their own ability to participate and be creative and responsive. I mean, how much in your own political futurism would you put towards the evolved human being becoming more capable and responsible for shaping that public space? There was a little bit in what you said that made me think that you were also looking at something that we've been looking at a lot in the alternative is, you know, how does society itself become responsible for the future rather than defer all the time to political parties? And, you know, and is that an area of growth? You know, what about decision making? You know, how, you know, what are the decision making platforms that you might have come across that you feel are worth paying attention to, for example?
The difficulty is we only need a very small percentage of people to do bad things with new technology to behave irresponsibly, and the good work of everybody else gets undermined. So we only need one bad actor to create a bioweapon. Today, the small number of people become suicidal and do bad things, crashing aeroplanes into mountains or other things, taking others with them. A small number of people, the Japanese sect Om Shinrikyo, some outgrowth of Buddhism with other bits of ideology melded in, they thought it was their mission to spread sarin gas in the Tokyo Underground. They also tried things with anthrax. Thankfully, they weren't successful, but they were going after PhDs in chemistry to help them. We only need a small number, and very bad things can happen, which is why just relying on people behaving better is not enough. We probably do need some element of more monitoring, some element of more regulation too, to constrain what new genetic compounds are created. There should be a careful record of everything that these groups create on behalf of others. In due course, I do hope that everybody will be living according to this higher state of morality, but we must not be naive. We must also realize that even people who most of the time are admirable still often have the depths of their character, some inner demons which can come out in the wrong ways. And again, we need to guard against that too. Getting the right balance is hard. We shouldn't expect it to be easy. We probably expect these problems of regulations to be just as hard as the engineering and technological problems in the first place to create the technology. And we need more people to get involved who understand the psychological issues, who also understand the technological issues, and who understand the limits of law. And we need these polymaths, and we need to encourage more of them. And they are the most important people to nurture. Of course, we can do it in part by getting people to talk to each other, but it's even better sometimes when the same ideas can rest inside a single person's head.
Oh, interesting thought. Maria, I think you had a question for David.
Yeah, just I guess question or sharing. Probably also kind of ties into what Sharon and Kirsten shared in the chat box, with this kind of a sense of control and autonomy when it comes to technology. So I did a retreat in the beginning of the year, and the Buddhist monk who was guiding it said, if you can't control your addiction to technology, you're screwed. And I definitely see that in my own life, because when I lose kind of control of the way that I use technology, I definitely feel a lot less happy than the periods when I'm in control of how I use technology. And different platforms such as Facebook, Netflix, YouTube, etc. So I feel really now like these platforms don't have that, like the sense of control embedded within them. So the only thing that I can do is to cultivate that myself. And I just would like to hear your thoughts on that. How can we do that better in the future so that technology helps us and not inhibits us? We don't become addicted, but we're in control.
Sure. So we are all grateful for many parts of technology. We're grateful for, most of us, for vaccines. Some of us are grateful for birth control. Some of us are grateful for Viagra. Some of us are grateful for the ability to travel around the world more quickly. And of course, we're grateful for this Zoom, which despite its problems are helping us. So, but we must be in control, absolutely. And we, if we're not careful, can be addicted, which is why we need to watch ourselves. And we also need to watch each other in a way. You know, we form little groups, and occasionally we can say to each other, give each other advice on things that we're doing where we're not living up honestly to the goals and values that we have each set. So part of the answer is in collective intelligence rather than just improved individual intelligence. And part of it might be technology that monitors us. There are apps that tell you when you've been using your iPhone too often, and you can get it to constrain your use in various ways. There may be other apps in the future that will keep an eye on you and steer us. And of course, the question is who owns and controls these apps? And it mustn't be a commercial entity. It must be something that is genuinely done on behalf of society as a whole, rather than being owned, which is why this must come into the public domain, rather than being something decided behind closed doors and just for profit.
Indeed. Well, we're coming up to the end of our session, but David, before you go, I'd like to invite you to share with the room something that I've always been really fascinated by, which is the idea that as we shift our understanding of what health means and how health could be advanced, and what that means for aging. You know, I sometimes imagine that if people could begin to feel the benefits of some of this, their whole attitude towards politics and possibility would change. I mean, literally, when you're feeling better and you have more energy and you're looking at your life expectancy very differently, everything looks different, you know, and almost as if, you know, if that's the beginnings of agency, that's the beginnings of you feeling like you can start to make a difference. So I wonder if you could just, in this last couple of minutes, just give our remaining audience, and of course all the people who'll be watching the replay of this video, some of the hints of the benefits of that coming along.
Well, let me talk about pet dogs. So currently we can intervene in the lives of mice and rats and flies and worms and make them live longer. If we can do it with pet dogs, at middle-aged, when they start getting droopy-tailed, and if we give them rapamycin or the other treatments that people like George Church at Harvard or Matt Kaeberlein are giving dogs, and if it's seen to give a new lease of life to dogs, then more people are going to say, maybe it can apply to us humans as well. Because people love their dogs, don't they? And they're very sad when they see their best friends becoming old and weary. And so when it is demonstrated as a technical possibility, it could cause an unexpectedly rapid change in mind, because all of us have got two conflicting thoughts in here. One is, growing old sucks. It's a real shame. I wish I could live longer. I wish my loved ones could live longer. But the other thing is, don't be selfish. Everybody dies. You've had your fair share. Don't go beyond 80 years and 10. You know, live a little bit longer than the average, but not much more. So we've got these two warring tribes. And once it's seen that it is actually possible, probably with a whole bunch of interventions like metformin and rapamycin and lots of other stuff that is being investigated and written about much more often. Once it's seen that more of us can become super agers, where people who live till 95 but without having cancer or Alzheimer's or dementia or heart disease or diabetes, once we understand how they do it and the same mechanisms that can be applied, that's going to help change views much more rapidly. And some parts of the world actually are already more positive towards it. I'm told if you ask people in Russia, would you like to live to 200? And a bigger percentage of people there say, yeah, sure, why not? Whereas in Britain, people say, oh, don't be silly, of course not. So we can get more people in Britain saying, yeah, sure, why not? Because when they see these other interventions. And when they see also, I don't want to be too flippant, when they see the argument for the longevity dividend, which is the argument that actually healthier living is better for the planet, because it won't divert resources into healthcare for people getting ill. We'll have more people who are full of the zest of life, who are able to work on improving the planet. So this economic argument will run hand in hand with the argument for demonstrating the practical rejuvenation. And this could change in as little as 5 years. In 5 years' time, more and more people around the place who say, hurry up and develop this rejuvenation biotechnology.
Sounds good to me. 200 years. I'll have to give that some thought, but certainly living healthily till 95 is. Yeah, I've got the book, David. I've got the book. The
argument's all in here. Yes,
I've got the book.
Thank you.
So, unless anybody has got a final question, I think we can say thank you very much indeed to David. And I think since there's only a few of us left in the room, as it's heading fast for dinner time. Any quick comments on your way out, please feel free to say. Otherwise, I'm going to invite you to join the Alternative UK and join our co-creators group and become active futurists with us at www.thealternative.org.uk. And thanks again, David. Look forward to doing a lot more futures work with you.
We all need to become futurists, just as we all need to be philosophers and all need to be historians, all need to be therapists. We desperately all need to become a futurist too.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you everyone for taking part, and see you next time.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.